Before we start, I have a big favor to ask. If you like my content, then please consider to like, share and subscribe. I would much appreciate it. Thank you very much, and now let's start.
Resident Evil.
One of the main questions in this video today is, does Resident Evil 2 has elevated black levels? And this question, my friends, is actually not very easy to answer. Okay, let's continue talking about the black level raise in Resident Evil 2, and again, I'm not quite sure if this is actually the right term for it, because in terms of black level raise, I couldn't find any evidence actually. So let me explain what I'm talking about. Usually when we have black level raise in HDR, and by the way, this right now is the SDR picture, then in many games I'm actually recommending to decrease the brightness from, let's say, 50 to 49 or 48, or in very unusual cases maybe to 42, because the black level raise is like crazy as hell. But Resident Evil it doesn't look like we have elevated black levels, so not in SDR and not in HDR. So for me, brightness setting 50 is doing loading screens, doing all the sceneries where I think we should have perfect black levels, like here. 50 is fine. So in my opinion right now, not in SDR and not in HDR we have any black level raise, and therefore brightness set to 50 is correct for the OLED LGZX. But there is something going on, and that's why we're starting here with SDR and with that's the very beginning from the game, because I like to show you a couple of things, or actually I like to explain a couple of things, because it's very hard to record actually this with the camera to get the right impression, to be honest. Okay, I tried it, but it is worse in a side-by-side comparison. Okay, so let me try to explain what I'm talking about. So again, this is the very beginning from the game, SDR with my recommended settings, and I'm going to share my recommended settings for SDR as well in this video, because it's very important that you set up this in the correct way, otherwise you have really elevated black levels. Anyway, let's just walk a little bit in the darkness here, and I'm very sure my camera is struggling to actually record this. But what I can see here is we have a lot of rain, and we have heavy rain. And you know what is happening in heavy rain? You have this like fog artifacts, or I don't know how to call it actually, but you have when there is a very bright light like this one, you have actually, yeah, this fog thing from rain. I don't know how to explain it, okay? And also it looks like that there's really some sort of fog going on behind the fence here. So there's not really perfect black, okay? But to be honest, it does look correct to me, because you have actually perfect black when you, this is too close, but when you look behind the fence, you see a little bit of grayish, but the fence here, the post here, is perfect black. Okay, so you get my point. Okay, so it looks like really that this game is capable of delivering perfect black levels with setting to 50, but it has also a very nice touch in terms of this fog stuff. Can you see this? And this is happening everywhere, actually everywhere. Here, I'm very sure camera can catch this, but here you have this very foggy picture right now. And yes, in HDR, it doesn't look, how should I say, quite right, but I can explain actually that it is right. But before we switch to HDR, another SDR scene. So now we are in the petrol shop here, and all what we have is actually our torch or flashlight, and we have a little bit light, of course, coming from outside from the car. And what I can see is that we have actually a lot of fine details here on the shelves, even here in the dark corners, or here I can see a lot of details, okay? Even more when I'm turning off my light, okay? So this looks really, really good in terms of contrast. I can't complain at all at this very moment. This looks fantastic in SDR and in HDR. The only thing what is HDR is doing, actually showing even more details. Okay, and now we're back with HDR, and I'm very sure it looks very similar to you on the camera or on your screen, because again, it's very hard to actually record HDR and SDR, or comparison between HDR and SDR. But what I can tell you is HDR is doing a great job in this game, and even now this looks a little bit more grayish, but it looks better because it does look more realistic actually to me. We have more shadow details in HDR. This is what I like to call it, okay? So because we need to start, or we need to stop actually thinking about HDR just in terms of maximum peak brightness. This is not correct. What we have also is much more shadow details, and I'm very sure, and I apologize for this, my camera can't catch this, but this right now, when you have the light here and you have here this very bright foggy rain, it does look great in HDR, and it doesn't look at all washed out or grayish, not at all. And when we go here, and we have done this before, it's the exactly same effect, but this time I have even more grayish here because of HDR, but this post here appears to be perfect black on my LG ZX. So you see, HDR in my opinion is doing a great job. All what we're getting more is actually more shadow details, and yes, in certain scenarios, and I will show you this in a second, it may look more washed out, but this is in my opinion, yeah, also done on purpose. Okay, and here we are again in the shop now, HDR enabled, and again we just have our torch and it does look great. Right now we just have a very bright picture here, and this is complete in the dark, and this looks fantastic. There's nothing, in my opinion, what remembers me of elevated black levels, but what we have here, I can see a lot of details actually, and right now it's a little bit hard actually because the lights are on, so I would highly recommend to play this game in a complete dark room, by the way, but there are a lot of details here what I can see, which makes this very, very realistic, because just because we have just a torch or a flashlight here, that doesn't mean we have light around her. Okay, you get my point. So at this very moment, look at this shadow. This is so realistic and good. No sign of elevated black levels at all at this very moment, but I have a different, and I don't want to spoil it too much, I have a different example for you where you might think different in terms of black level, because I do the same. Okay, so we are now in the police station, still HDR enabled, and Leon here is, yeah, walking through this floor or whatever. Actually, it's not a floor, it's a hallway, and this level right now, or scenario, whatever you call it, looks completely washed out in terms of black levels. Everything is grayish, but to be very honest, I think this is really done on purpose, because I verified already that, yeah, the brightness setting 50 is correct, and I can't see in the very beginning of the game, I can't see elevated black levels, or maybe I missed it, but you get my point, I hope so. There is something weird here. Either this is done on purpose and it does look absolutely washed out, maybe because everything is wet here or whatever, or maybe that's just the style from this hallway or floor, and that's how the developer, yeah, decided to do it actually. But I agree with you that this is very, very weird. But the point is, this is not just in HDR, and this is now SDR, and it does look exactly the same in terms of elevated black levels. The only difference is that we have less actually. The whole picture is darker. Therefore, we have also not the same amount of raised black levels. But again, I don't think it is the right term. We don't have raised black levels. It is just a very weird style from the game actually, because right now this is SDR. Everything is set, in my opinion, to the correct settings or values, and it does look very, very similar to HDR. Again, the only difference is really that in terms of shadow details, we have less than an HDR. We have, of course, a little bit less grayish fog. Let's call it like this, okay? And the reason is very, very simple, because we have a very small dynamic range in SDR. In HDR, we have a very big dynamic range. Therefore, when we're talking about, let's say this is the shadow details, okay? So in SDR, we have this dynamic range. Very small shadow details, okay? Or very yeah, not a big amount, okay? In HDR we have a very big dynamic range, therefore we have much more, there's a much better possibility actually to show more details in shadows or in very dark areas, and this is exactly what is happening. When I switch now to HDR, I can see more textures, more edges and stuff like that, but the general impression is exactly the same. It is washed out, it does look washed out, but again, this is not a problem with HDR. The same counts for SDR. Okay, so let's finish up with elevated black levels, because in my opinion it is the art style from the game and we don't have actually a problem with elevated black levels, but maybe I'm just wrong about it, okay? Nevertheless, I would strongly recommend to play this game in HDR because it is so much better than SDR in my opinion. All these bright objects, the specular highlights, are much better in HDR compared to SDR. So SDR has a dynamic range in this game from 0 to 160 candela, and in HDR I had actually a dynamic range from 0 to around 800 candela with my recommended settings. So again, HDR is the way to go. Okay, so now let's start talking about HDR settings. And no, Resident Evil 2 does not support the system level HDR calibration on the console, not on the PlayStation 5 and not on the Xbox, and the reason is because we have HDR settings in the game. The HDR settings in Resident Evil 2 are actually straightforward. There's just one thing to consider. Let's say you like to test and try the game in SDR and therefore you disable HDR on the console. Then when you re-enable HDR on the console, make sure HDR is actually turned on, because it will be turned off automatically when you play this game in SDR, okay? But let's talk about HDR settings. We have exactly two settings. We have the maximum brightness setting and we have the brightness setting. And of course, I'm going to show you or share with you my recommended settings in a second. But before I show you my settings, I like to talk about HGiG, dynamic tone mapping off and dynamic tone mapping on. And then after this, I like to talk about SDR, and then I promise I show you my recommended settings for HDR and SDR, okay? So HGiG, dynamic tone mapping off, dynamic tone mapping on. My recommendation is, if you play this game in a complete dark room, and this would be the best scenario actually, then I would strongly recommend to use HGiG. In my opinion, this is the best way to play this game. I haven't had any problems in terms of brightness or the average picture brightness, because it's fine. It's fine. But again, this is absolutely up to you. As always, dynamic tone mapping off, in my opinion, is the worst choice, because you lose a little bit of peak brightness in specular highlights. But to be very honest, this game is not a showcase in terms of HDR, okay? So don't expect too much, okay? But still, HDR is the best choice to play this game. Or you use dynamic tone mapping on, which gives you, and you can see this, a brighter average picture brightness. Brighter average picture brightness. That's not a correct English, but you get my point. Okay, as always, dynamic tone mapping on will brighten up the picture. In terms of the specular highlights, in terms of the peak brightness of specular highlights, there's no difference between dynamic tone mapping on and HGiG. Sometimes dynamic tone mapping on delivers a little bit brighter specular highlights, sometimes HGiG, okay? But overall, zero difference. The only difference what you can see here is a brighter average picture brightness. But in my opinion, HGiG, complete dark room, a nice 5.1 Dolby surround setup, and you're good to go. Okay, so let's talk about the SDR settings, because this is actually very important if you like to play this game in SDR, because the standard factory settings are absolutely terrible wrong. So standard factory setting is actually everything is in the middle, but first screen already, we're talking about the maximum brightness in SDR, and maximum brightness in SDR is 160 candela. So every single monitor, even it's an average monitor, should be able to deliver 160 candela, okay? So make sure actually you increase this to the brighter side, okay, to the brighter side, and don't focus on this actually. Even you lose already, or the pattern are already not visible or barely visible in the middle of, forget it, okay? Just go to the brighter side, because this is the maximum peak brightness then for SDR, maximum peak brightness 160 candela, okay? So press confirm, and the next screen is very, very important because this is the screen which can give you elevated black levels, okay? So standard setting again is usually in the middle, and this is adjust value until the pattern is just barely visible, and this is around, yeah, here, one tick before the darker side. But don't follow the instructions, just go to the complete left side, okay, to the darker side, go to the dark side, okay? Please do me the favor, because I will just show you this, what will happen if you set this up in the wrong way actually. So right now you can see no elevated black levels because it was set up to the complete dark side. But if you would go to the bright side and you just press confirm, can you see what just happened? The whole picture is just gray. Let me just go back and let me put this on the other side, and I'm pressing confirm. Can you see the difference? So make sure you really have the setting to the complete dark side. It sounds cool, huh? Go to the dark side on the minimum brightness, okay? So this one here is also very, very tricky, but you can't do too much wrong. The only thing what you can lose is actually a little bit shadow details, or you have a little bit too bright shadow details, okay? So you have to try this on your own, what fits the best for your TV. For my OLED TV, I found actually setting 5 plus 5, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is the best value for my LG CX in a complete dark room. But again, this is maybe different for your TV. Okay, so let's talk about my recommended settings for HDR in Resident Evil 2 for HGiG and dynamic tone mapping on. For HGiG and dynamic tone mapping on, the settings are exactly the same. What you like to use better is really up to you. I still prefer HGiG. Okay, so let's talk about brightness setting in this game, and as you can see, I have actually two values here. One recommendation, and this is leave it in the factory setting, which is 0. And as you can see, I marked this actually, everything in the middle is 0, and then you have -10 or +10. The maximum setting in terms of going minus, so that means make the picture a little bit darker to maybe get rid a little bit about this foggy picture in some scenarios. And again, I don't think it's elevated black levels, but I may be wrong, okay? Anyway, don't go below -7, because if you go to -8, you lose the maximum peak brightness in specular highlights. I would not recommend to go into the plus actually, because you will just over brighten the picture too much in my opinion. In terms of the maximum brightness setting, which is the maximum peak brightness for your TV, for the CX, C1, C2 and G1, which is around 800 candela, go to -2. For the S95B G2, which is around 1000 candela, +2. And yes, I know that the S95B can deliver 1500 nits on a 2% window, but this is just on a 2% window, and the 10% maximum peak brightness from the S95B is around 1000 candela, and therefore I recommend to use 1000 candela, and this is setting +2. For the Q90 and 95 series, which can deliver around 1700 candela after calibration, it's +5. So please make sure, or please keep in mind, that the S95B and G2 settings are really just recommendations, because I can't verify how it looks like. But to be very honest, it does look great on the Q90 series, and it does look great on the CX series. So it is for sure great on the S95B and G2 as well. And here we are with the SDR settings, and again, this is very important that you set this up in the correct way if you like to play this game in SDR. And again, those settings are not affecting the HDR settings at all. That means you can set up everything what you like here, and if you change to HDR, those settings are not affecting anything in HDR. So in terms of maximum peak brightness, make sure you go +10, which means it's on the right side. In terms of the minimum brightness, it's very important that you go -10, which is completely on the left. And in terms of brightness, I found on my Q90 95B, sorry, and my CX, +5 is the best value. For the S95B and G2, I recommend exactly the same settings. Okay, and that's it for this video. I hope you had fun and my settings are actually fitting your TV. And If you like this content, again, please like, share and subscribe. Thank you very much. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.